Welcome to Lesson 3 in this unit on chords for the ABRSM Grade 5 Music Theory examination. In Lesson 1, we looked at triads built upon the tonic, supertonic, subdominant, dominant and submediant in all keys, major and minor, using up to 6 sharps or flats. And in Lesson 2, we used that knowledge to select the correct chords to harmonise a tune. And in this lesson, we're going to look at cadences. You've heard that little tune any number of times, I'm sure. And that pair of chords at the end is a perfect example of what musicians call a perfect cadence. Now, a cadence, put simply, is the musical equivalent of a punctuation mark in language. And that last example, it sounds, I suppose, like a musical full stop. Here it is again. I was playing it in C major, and here is the tune written on the staves. But it is what is underneath the tune that is important, the chords I'm using to harmonise the tune and the last 2 notes of the tune. And here they are. Under the first of these harmonised notes, a chord of G major, and under the last, a chord of C major, or, to use the knowledge we gained in Lesson 1, the dominant followed by the tonic. And that is the definition of a perfect cadence. The dominant chord followed by the tonic chord. Those didn't quite sound like I'd finished them off. If I were to compare them to a punctuation mark, I couldn't really say that they were like a full stop, more like a comma. They feel incomplete. And that, to use the musician's terminology, is an imperfect cadence. Basically, an imperfect cadence is any cadence which finishes on the dominant chord. The most common is where the dominant chord follows a tonic chord, but the best definition of an imperfect cadence is one ending on the dominant chord. Now that's slightly different to the perfect cadence, and it's a good example of what musicians call a plagal cadence. The last note and its accompanying chord are the same as in the perfect cadence. Both end on the tonic chord. But instead of a dominant chord on the first note, we have a subdominant chord. It doesn't quite sound as strong and final an ending to the musical sentence as a perfect cadence. In older books of music theory, these plagal cadences were also occasionally called Amen cadences because there used to be a tradition in some churches of singing Amen to a plagal cadence at the end of hymns. So, a plagal cadence is a subdominant followed by the tonic. Well, we've covered the perfect, imperfect and plagal cadences and thus covered the syllabus for the ABRSM. But the ABRSM syllabus doesn't include what follows, which I consider to be really quite important. So one more cadence only, And then you'll get that rather fuller picture I so often accuse the ABRSM of failing to deliver. And why do you think I think it's important to burden you with 4 cadences rather than 3? Well, if you're also doing GCSE music, you will need to be able to identify this next one, as well as the 3 covered on the ABRSM syllabus. In fact, you've already heard an example of one in lesson 2 of this unit on that final example. Here it is again. Yes, in that final phrase played twice, we had a cadence the first time where the chords were 5 followed by 6. Then the second phrase with the chords being 5 then 1. Well, in this lesson we've already gained the knowledge to describe the 5-1 cadence. That's your perfect cadence. But it's the other cadence, 5 to 6. It starts off as though it were a perfect cadence, but right at the last moment, the harmonies get sidetracked as though the composer has had an interruption to the flow of his thoughts. How about these versions of our very familiar tune from earlier in this lesson? Each one of those cadences started, like the perfect cadence, with a dominant chord, but each one failed to make the landing on the tonic chord. All of those nearly perfect cadences are interrupted cadences, the dominant followed by something else. By far the most common version of the interrupted cadence is this one. The dominant chord, followed by the chord of the submediant. The dominant tonic perfect cadence is being interrupted by a trip from the dominant to the submediant. And that is what happened to that tune at the end of lesson 2. So for the purposes of GCSE music examinations, the interrupted cadence goes from dominant to submediant, but it can go from dominant to anywhere but tonic. Remember please that this is bonus material and goes rather beyond the ABRSM music theory syllabus. So how is this going to be assessed? You'll be given 2 cadences to identify, presented with 2 staves as written for choir, with soprano and alto parts in the upper stave, and tenor and bass parts in the lower stave. The cadence to be identified will be highlighted by a square bracket above, and you'll even be told the key. Being told the key, all you will need to do for the ABRSM theory exam is jot down the tonic, subdominant and dominant chords for that key, and for GCSE, the submediant triad too, and then identify the notes in those triads built on those notes. So, if you are faced with an example in, say, F major, you identify the 1st, 4th and 5th notes of the scale as being F, B flat and C, and you create the triads on those notes. The chord of 1, the tonic chord, FAC, the subdominant chord 4, B flat D F, and the dominant chord 5, C E G. And if you're doing your GCSE exams and it might be an interrupted cadence, the submediant chord D F A. Using this information, examine those cadential chords and determine what they are using the Roman numerals. And from the information we've already gained and tabulated in the printable support material, work out which cadence we have been presented with. In this instance, it happens that we need only identify the final chord. It contains C, E and G, so can only be a dominant chord, which we can label 5. And we know that the only sort of cadence ending with a dominant chord is an imperfect cadence. So we don't actually need to bother identifying the first chord of the cadence. This is an important shortcut. Identify the final chord in the cadence first, because it saves you time in the exam. Let's have a look at these next 3 examples. Here we're in A major. Let's look at the final chord first. It contains A, C sharp and E, so it's a tonic chord in A. We now know we have to have a look at the previous chord. The chord before it has D's in soprano and bass, and an F sharp and an A. So the notes are part of a D major triad, and D is the subdominant of A major, so the cadential chords are subdominant to tonic, 4 to 1, which makes this cadence a plagal cadence. In this next example, we're in the key of C minor. The final chord contains C, E flat and G, so it's the tonic chord C minor. And the previous chord contains G, B natural and D, a G major chord, and it's the dominant chord of C, the chord of the 5th note of the scale. So 5-1 makes it a perfect cadence. And here in our final example in D major, when we look at the final chord, it contains B, D and F sharp. It's a B minor triad, and B is the submediant of D major, so we can label this chord with a 6. And again, we don't actually need to worry about the previous chord, as we know it will be a dominant chord, an A major chord. So this cadence goes 5 to 6, so it is an interrupted cadence. Don't forget that more examples can be found in the printable support material, and come back to lesson 4 for advice on how to answer the final question in this part of the music theory exam. See you soon.